Hello and welcome to Deathrow Exoneration channel. The death sentence is part of a lot of countries present. It is a controversial way of punishment with a lot of people fighting for it to be abolished on one side, and other to keep using the death sentence as a punishment for the most hideous crimes. Although the justice system's objective is to trial and sentence criminals, sometimes things go wrong and innocent people are accused and wrongly sentenced to death. This is the story of one of them. Today's case takes us almost 200 years back. It is a famous case and also among the first death conviction ever recorded in USA history. Being such an old case, the circumstances of the crime and the lifestyle of the people living in the 1850s was completely different than nowadays. In 1850, by the Omnibus Bill, California was admitted into the Union as a state. Society in this newly organized state was composed of persons coming from all quarters of the globe, drawn there by the gold fever. Many were lawless adventurers who gave no end of trouble to the law-abiding citizens, partly due to the inadequacy of law enforcement machinery. Among these elements were some escaped convicts from the penal colony in Australia, and they came to be feared as the Sydney Men. In the boom town of San Francisco, the Sydney Men were the scourge of the city, committing murders and robberies with apparent impunity. Public opinion became enraged at the uninterrupted wave of crime. It broke beyond bounds in February 1851, when Mr. C. J. Jansen was attacked in his store on the night of the 19th, was mercilessly beaten, and was robbed of approximately $2,000. Mr. Jansen was the senior partner in the much-respected firm of C. J. Jansen & Company, dry goods merchants. As was the custom of many merchants, Mr. Jansen on the evening in question was working upon his books. He was alone in the store and was seated at his desk working by the light of a candle, the sole light in the large room. At about 8 o'clock, a bewhiskered man, wearing a gray coat and broad-brimmed hat, entered the store and started looking at various piles of merchandise. He then called Mr. Jansen and said that he desired to purchase some blankets. While these were being shown, another man entered and also desired to see blankets. This man was taller than the first, wore a hat pointed at the crown, and was wrapped up in a coat. As Mr. Jansen was bending over some blankets, one man cried, "Now," whereupon the other struck the merchant, sending him sprawling, and then beat him nearly to death. Thereupon, the desk was opened and the money stolen. Jansen soon recovered sufficiently to crawl to the door and give the alarm. Theodore Payne, a storekeeper across the street, rushed to the victim's assistance. The authorities were notified and an immediate search instituted. The description given by Jansen of the tall robber corresponded with that of one of the most notorious of the Sydney Men, James Stewart, who had a striking record for knavery throughout the California mining area. He was one of those heroic desperados who delighted in his crimes and in thwarting the law. He was already wanted by the authorities for many crimes, among them being the cold-blooded murder of Charles Moore, near Foster Bar in Yuba County. The attack upon Jansen intensified the search for Stewart. Within 24 hours, the police arrested a suspect, and he was immediately charged with the crime. Another Australian, Robert Windred, was apprehended as the accomplice. Both men denied having had anything to do with the attack on Jansen, and the first man arrested swore that he was Thomas Berdue, an innocent British subject, and that he was not the notorious James Stewart. This was a common trick among the Sydney Men, and he was not believed. Both men were taken before Jansen, who was wavering between life and death, and he identified Berdue as his principal assailant. When the people heard that James Stewart was in custody, excitement ran high. The legal machinery had slipped so often and had so frequently permitted the criminals to escape, as had Stewart on previous occasions, that there arose a spontaneous insistence that Stewart must not escape punishment. While the men were being conducted under heavy police guard from Jansen's residence back to the police station, a large crowd of men tried to seize the prisoners to hang them at once, but the attempt failed. On Saturday, February 21st, the men were arraigned before Justice Shepard for examination. They attempted to establish alibis. The crowd outside the courthouse, now numbering nearly 7,000 people, was almost frantic at the further delay and again attempted to seize the prisoners, but the sheriff, assisted by the Washington Guards, saved them. A meeting was then organized which appointed a citizens' committee to stay at the jail to make sure that the prisoners did not escape. Adjournment was then voted until 10 o'clock the following day, Sunday. The crowd quietly dispersed. On the following morning a throng of 8,000 to 10,000 persons congregated. The complete lack of confidence in the courts was manifest. The crowd was determined to see the prisoners punished. Mob violence was feared. Mr. William T. Coleman addressed the throng and suggested the organization of a popular court of citizens to try the prisoners at once before they could escape. This was heartily and boisterously approved. Judge, jury, and counsel were selected and the trial held during the afternoon and evening in the recorder's room of the City Hall but in the absence of the prisoners. Testimony was heard on both sides. The jury stood 9-3 for conviction and reported a disagreement. The 3 dissenting jurors had doubts as to the prisoners' identities. The congregated people were disposed to lynch the accused just the same, and several attempts to seize them were made, but wiser counsel prevailed and the prisoners were safely secreted and detained for action by the regular courts. On several occasions within a few days, the 2 accused men had been within a hairbreadth of popular execution. There was no doubt as to their guilt in the popular mind. Windred later escaped. The man who claimed to be Thomas Berdue was regularly indicted under the name of James Stewart for an assault with intent to kill Mr. Jansen. He was brought to trial on March 14 in the district court before Judge Parsons. The district attorney, G. K. Platt, and C. M. Brossman appeared for the prosecution. The prisoner was defended by Messrs. Calhoun Benham and Hall McAllister. The principal witness for the state was Mr. Jansen, who positively identified the prisoner as his assailant. An attempt was made to establish an alibi, but it was not conclusively established. According to the defense witnesses, the prisoner left a group of friends to go to bed at just about 8 o'clock on the fatal evening. 8 o'clock was the time of the assault. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, and the prisoner was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment in the state prison. The large amount of money which had been found upon the accused when arrested was delivered to Mr. Jansen. The convicted prisoner was not imprisoned under this sentence, for he was immediately sent to Marysville, in Yuba County, to stand trial in the district court for the murder of Moore. This trial was held from June 28 to July 4, 1851. There was no question but that the notorious James Stewart had committed this murder. This was not contested by the defendant. The sole issue was whether or not the defendant was James Stewart as contended by the state, or was an entirely distinct and innocent person, Thomas Berdue, as he claimed to be. An interesting account of the testimony as related by one of the attorneys appearing in the case is quoted by Mr. Bancroft in his History of Popular Tribunals. Witnesses for the prosecution were generally bold and entirely positive, but the witnesses for the prisoner, with the exception of Judge Stidger and B. F. Washington, appeared to feel uneasy, and often hesitated in their testimony. Some 3 or 4 witnesses testified that they had worked with Jim Stewart at Foster Bar, and had known him well before he went there. They had eaten with him at the same table often, and had played cards with him, and 1 or 2 testified they had slept with him. They testified that Jim Stewart was of the same height as the prisoner, that he had curly hair, like him, that he was slightly bald on the top of the head, like him, that his actions were like his, the court having made the prisoner stand up several times so that the witnesses could see him better than when sitting, that his voice and accent were the same, being English, that the color of the eyes and hair were the same, and that Jim Stewart had a stiff middle finger on the right hand, and a ring of Indian ink round one of his fingers, and marks of Indian ink between each thumb and forefinger, and further, that Jim Stewart had a rather long scar on his right cheek. The jury then examined the hands of the prisoner, and there was found a ring of Indian ink on one of his fingers. Several figures were spots of the same ink between the thumb and forefinger of each hand, and the right middle finger was not stiff, but had a felon under the nail of the corresponding finger on the other hand, which had given it a short but stubby appearance, heavier at the end than elsewhere, the nail of the finger being broad and thick, and bending inward over the end of the finger. This was startling to the defense, indeed. It remained now to see if the prisoner had a scar on the right side of the face. His face could not be satisfactorily examined, as it was almost completely covered with a short growth of hair. The court ordered the prisoner to be shaved before being brought into court next morning, and on being examined a scar about the length of the one described by the witnesses was found, commencing on the edge of the jaw on the right side and running down the neck. The witnesses now seemed confident, and said that they had no doubt that the prisoner was Jim Stewart. On a cross-examination they said, in a positive and unhesitating manner, that it was not possible that they could be mistaken in their opinion that the prisoner was Jim Stewart. Colonel Prentice swore positively that the prisoner was Jim Stewart, and that he could not possibly be mistaken. Some 4 or 5 witnesses swore positively as to the identity of the prisoner, and that he was Jim Stewart beyond a question, each giving some 1 or more new reasons for his belief. No witness on the side of the prosecution would admit a probability that he could be mistaken in the prisoner, that he certainly was Jim Stewart. On the side of the defense, Judge Stidger swore positively that the prisoner at the bar was not Jim Stewart, that there was a strong resemblance between Jim Stewart and this man, but that Jim Stewart was at least 2 inches taller than the prisoner, that their eyes were different in color, that the expression of the eyes of the 2 men was different, that Jim Stewart was much quicker in his motions than the prisoner, that Jim Stewart's motions were very uncommon, being as quick as those of a wildcat, that he had always head erect, much more so than the prisoner, and that the real Jim Stewart was straighter in his personal formation, and had a different complexion. This witness testified that Jim Stewart was often arraigned before him as a judge at Foster Bar, and that his recollection of him from this and other facts was clear and distinct. Stidger also testified that Jim Stewart had a stiff middle finger, but not such a one as the prisoner had. B. F. Washington, who was at the time recorder of Sacramento City, testified that he knew Jim Stewart from the fact of his being a notorious character in that city, and from the fact that he had often been brought before him on different charges. Mr. Washington said that the prisoner at the bar was not Jim Stewart, that there was some resemblance, but they were to his eye quite different men, that Jim Stewart was 1.5 inches or 2 inches taller than the prisoner. Other witnesses for the defense testified to about the same facts, but they seemed to be uneasy, in some trepidation, and acted in a manner most provoking to the defense. One witness on behalf of the prosecution, a Mr. Thompson, testified that the prisoner, about the date of the alleged murder, came into a camp on Slate Range, in said county of Yuba, on horseback, and seemed to have plenty of money, and was betting with the boys on a string game which he played very skillfully. That he had a conversation with the prisoner in the jail, and that the prisoner admitted that he was at Slate Range at the time mentioned, but denied that he was Jim Stewart. After deliberating approximately 2 days, the jury, on July 4, 1851, returned a verdict of guilty. The prisoner was sentenced to be hanged. Resigned to his fate, after attempting to prove throughout the popular trial and the 2 regular trials that he was not James Stewart, his money exhausted, and deserted by his friends, the prisoner prepared for the end by communicating his wretched fate to his family. All the while he protested his innocence. The popular discontent with the enforcement of law in San Francisco led, early in June, 1851, to the organization by local business men of a vigilance committee. They often took the law into their own hands and proceeded forthwith to try persons and execute those who it was thought merited such punishment. The executions were public and notorious, and were generally supported by public opinion and the press. On July 1, 1851, a shack in the outskirts of the city had been robbed. A party of men were beating the brush in search of the thief. Unexpectedly they came upon a neatly dressed man who could give no proper account of himself. Although it did not appear that he had robbed the house, he aroused the searchers' suspicions and was taken to the rooms of the Vigilance Committee. The man gave his name as William Stevens and made an excellent impression upon the committee by his pleasing personality and apparent frankness. They proposed to release him, when one of the citizens on guard duty recognized the prisoner as the much-dreaded outlaw, James Stewart. Great was the delight of the committee. Within a month of the creation of their organization, fortune had placed within their grasp one of the worst desperados of California. Elation did not, however, completely overshadow the recollection of the man who claimed to be Thomas Berdue, who had been convicted as Stewart in San Francisco, and who had been sent to Marysville to be tried for one of Stewart's murders. Letters were at once dispatched to Marysville with the news of the capture of the real Stewart and with the request that the outstanding identification witnesses be sent to San Francisco. The Marysville people were skeptical, but the witnesses were sent as requested. A number of people were found nearby who had known James Stewart and they now identified him without any hesitation. Mr. Jansen became convinced of his mistake in identification, though the resemblance between Berdue and Stewart was said to be close. On July 8, 1851, 4 days after Berdue had been sentenced to death, Stewart signed a written confession of his many crimes, including the assault upon Mr. Jansen. The Vigilance Committee successfully evaded several writs of habeas corpus which were issued to force the delivery of Stewart to the regular authorities, and on July 11, 1851, he was publicly executed in the presence of 500 members of the Vigilance Committee and thousands of residents. This was done with the approval of public opinion and of the leading newspapers. Upon full proof that James Stewart, the person executed on July 11th, was the true perpetrator of the crimes for which Thomas Berdue had been convicted in the district courts of San Francisco and Yuba County, Governor John McDougall pardoned Berdue. The members of the San Francisco Vigilance Committee, learning that the poor fellow was penniless, collected for him a fund which amounted to $302. The money which had been taken from him and given to Mr. Jansen at the time of his arrest, over $1,700, and some gold dust, was returned by Mr. Jansen, with a liberal gift in addition. On January 21, 1853, Senator Kurtz of San Diego presented to the Senate of California the petition of Thomas Berdue for reimbursement of the $4,000 which it was said he had expended in his fight to prove his innocence. The petition was referred to the Committee on the Judiciary, of which Senator J. W. Ralston was the chairman. The committee recommended that the petition be refused for the following reasons. To grant the prayer of the petitioner would establish a precedent which, if carried out in all cases of the kind, would more than exhaust the entire revenue of the state. We know of no legislative precedent for such appropriation. The most that has been done was to refund fines illegally collected from innocent parties, leaving them responsible for their own expenses. In society it too often happens that the innocent are wrongfully accused of crime. This is their misfortune, and government has no power to relieve them. It is a part of the price each individual may be called on to pay for the protection which the laws give. He should rejoice that the laws have afforded that protection to him when wrongfully accused, rather than seek remuneration for his expenses from the government whose justice has protected him from ignominious death. H. H. Bancroft, the historian, comments as follows on this reasoning. That is to say, stripped of verbiage, to correct the errors of law would cost more than all the expenses of government combined. We have never known a legislature to right a wrong done by the law to a citizen, therefore we will not. Prosecution may be the price of protection, and fortunate is he who is not done to death by laws established to save his life. The mistaken identity in this case almost resulted in an execution of the wrong man. In 3 separate trials Berdue was convicted of crimes committed by Stewart. That the popular excitement and demand for revenge, aroused by the frustration of justice on so many occasions, was largely responsible for Berdue's convictions is highly probable. It is not an unusual operative element in similar miscarriages of justice. That Berdue came very close to destruction by mob violence is apparent. That the victim of the crime identified Berdue, naturally operated most strongly against him, and his perfectly sound and truthful alibi was disbelieved. The Legislative Committee's reason for refusing to reimburse Berdue's expenses is an antiquated one and is destitute of foundation, yet it is on occasion heard now. The Vigilance Committee and Mr. Jansen did what they could to restore the money that was taken from Berdue, but his real injury remained irreparable. His public vindication, which is often denied to less fortunate but equally deserving victims of similar error, lay in the fact that the real culprit proved to be so notorious a criminal as Stewart and in the fact that the case became a landmark in the early history of California as a state. An advance in the conception of public obligation in such matters has taken place, as is manifest in the California law of 1913, which would, had it been in force in 1851, have afforded Berdue a natural opportunity for indemnity and vindication. Unfortunately, even in the present we have cases of mistaken identity, although it is not as flagrant as it was 130 years ago, we still have people that are sentenced to death but they are innocent. And to make matters worse, as we will see in the future videos, it is next to impossible to prove your innocence once you are sentenced. There are very few people that are willing to hear your story and commit to fight for it. But those few people that are ready to listen are heroes most of the time. They manage to save innocent people from death, sometimes with only minutes to spare. It is hard for me to speak about this subject. It is impossible for me to comprehend what the victim's family feel during the exoneration of a person. While someone is wrongly convicted and sentenced to death, the real killer is at large and not being punished for their crime. So when a mistake is made in the justice system and the wrong person is convicted, the tragedy hits the innocent and the victim's family. I hope you enjoyed this case. For me it was great to research it and it was worth the time to bring it to light. Have a good day and I will see you in the next video.